Hi, everyone. This is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm here today with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. And today's episode is going to be part two of biases and sibling estrangement. Now, biases are mental shortcuts or distortions in thinking that influence how we perceive, interpret, and respond to situations, often without us realizing it. In the context of sibling estrangement, biases can act like invisible barriers that shape how we remember past interactions, assign blame, and justify our feelings or actions. And they color our perceptions of each other, making it harder to bridge divides or see the situation from another's perspective. And in today's episode, we'll be recognizing these other biases that we haven't had a chance to go through in our last episode. And we'll have a better understanding of how it is that we can see where misunderstandings can deepen and how it is that relationships can drift or fall apart. So, Fern, it's great to have you here again on this subject matter. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I have to introduce the topic once again by remembering what Malcolm Gladwell wrote, I believe in The Tipping Point, and that is the idea that so much data is coming into the brain that it's like a computer on overload. And the only way to manage all this data is to shortcut. And biases are essentially those shortcuts. The problem with biases is that you make and draw conclusions quickly, and they can be unfair and wrong.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important point to make, right? This idea that even though they're shortcuts, it doesn't mean the shortcut leads us necessarily into the right place, right?
Which is why it's important to be mindful of the biases.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good segue into the first one that we want to talk about today now. The first one we wanted to bring up is anchoring bias. Now, anchoring bias has to do with the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered, right?
Mm. Yeah, that's like when you go and give your best impression to the teacher on the first day of school and kind of fall off after that. Yeah, you have to be careful. A sibling might hold onto an early childhood memory of being mistreated and let it shape their current relationships within the family, even though those dynamics may have changed.
Exactly. And I think that's really, really important not to get locked into a particular position because I see this where people will refer back to the past constantly, right? And come back to that particular point in which they may have gotten hurt and such. And I think it's important not to be dismissive of the hurt, but also to recognize that things can evolve from there and a relationship should be seen as a whole in its entirety rather than just on one particular aspect of it. And I think that this type of bias really prevents us a sense of balanced understanding of relationships.
Well, actually, it's a good jumping off point for conversation and dialogue so that you can begin to dispel those impressions.
Exactly. It's always good to bring this up and clear up any misunderstandings or perhaps be able to offer a refreshing and differing vision on certain things, especially. So that way it can help to smooth and harmonize relationships with siblings, especially. So, all right. So the next bias is in group, out group bias. What is that? People may wonder, right? And quite simply, that has to do with favoring members of one's own group while being critical of outsiders.
So one sibling might align closely with a parent or a specific family faction and then exclude others. And this plays in a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, and that is favoritism and this whole idea of how favoritism negatively affects each family member.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really important to highlight that, especially, and triangulation as well, too, right? This is kind of what this alludes to when it comes to this particular type of bias. And I think it's really important not to allow ourselves to succumb into creating factions within families, because once that starts to happen, then you're really paving the path for estrangement right then and there, because there's some people that are in the in group and those that aren't, right?
You see this in these large families, particularly where they break down into cliques.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cliques is a great way of saying it, as a matter of fact, right? You got people that are in the clique and people that aren't. And that's what makes it hard, especially I find in some family settings. And there's this idea of implied hierarchy again, like we are alluding to earlier in about favoritism and such. I think that that's something that's important to highlight as a risk factor as well when it comes to how we can think and how it is that this can go against inclusivity and such within families.
And it can particularly play out if there's a large age gap. So you have two who are older and two who are younger, and they don't have that many shared experiences.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's important also to be mindful of that. Sometimes there can be those types of factors, chronological age that can come into that and perhaps affect that as well if we're not careful. So another type of bias is what's called self-serving bias. And this is the tendency to credit oneself for successes while blaming other people or external factors for failure and such.
So a sibling might take credit for maintaining the family relationship, but blame others for a breakdown. And again, this plays into favoritism as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think this is a type of bias that we can sometimes see playing itself out, right? Even in the political arena, right? Well, where people will take credit for certain things, right? But be very specific that if things aren't working out, it's because of other people or other things going on, right?
Well, or disinformation.
Right? Exactly. So we need to be careful about this particular type of bias because I think it prevents accountability and resolution, right? When you tend to take on the credit for certain things instead of recognizing that it might be a group effort and that some people are still working for that same outcome within the family and such. It's really important to make room for people and such so they can be themselves and to get the sense that we are able to embrace people's efforts at inclusivity and perhaps working towards a common vision that's in the interest of everybody.
And the importance of acknowledgement so that everybody is seen as valuable in this operation.
Absolutely. So important to be able to recognize that. Now, another type of bias is what's called availability heuristic. Now, what is that? You know, and I think that that has to do with judging the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, right?
That's dangerous. A
Mhm.
sibling might recall a dramatic family argument and overestimate how often conflicts occur. And this, I think this is also ties into this negative bias, which is this idea that the thing that upsets you the most is very present in your mind.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So it's really important to be mindful of that and recognize how it is that this type of bias can really create a distorted view of family dynamics and it can really discourage attempts to reconnect. Because oftentimes, if you do bring it back to a particular incident or something that that you may have experienced in the past, that yes may have been perhaps difficult and such, but always bringing it back to only one particular singular event then and generalizing with that, the risk is, of course, that you're not seeing things clearly, and it can elicit all sorts of defenses as well when people feel that they're finger pointed with regards to some of this.
Yeah, a lot of it is about how you frame something. So if you're framing it negatively, that's how that's the lens you got.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I think that's really important to be mindful of that and to, of course, have a just vision of how it is that you can, of course, experience yourself within that family and how others can experience themselves as well in their own authentic ways. So,
I mean, I think the key, just to add to what you're saying, is to step back and see the big picture.
exactly, exactly. That's a great way of simplifying that and saying it in such a way. Yes. As a matter of fact, to be able to step back and look at things just as they should be and such, and not necessarily focus just on one single area, can help, of course, to harmonize and perhaps validate more family members together, especially. So, another type of bias is what's called groupthink. Now, groupthink has to do with the tendency for a group to prioritize harmony over critical thinking, often leading to poor decisions.
and a lot of hurt. A
Mhm.
family might collectively decide to ostracize a member without critically evaluating the situation. Actually, you described some of this in a previous episode where there are assumptions made in families that aren't necessarily true.
Exactly. And we need to be careful about that, especially. And I think that that's what happens is that unfortunately, if people are cast aside and such or excommunicated from a family, it could have a really detrimental effect, I think, if people aren't careful with that, because it really reinforces estrangement and it prevents individual family members from forming their own opinions and such. So, groupthink is actually something that we see sometimes in cults, as a matter of fact, right? You don't want to have people being dissidents within the family or whatnot. And it can mean that if you start doing this or saying something that other people may not necessarily agree with, then yes, it's the idea of being cast out or perhaps marginalized in such a way that others will be protected from your differing views, quote unquote, right?
Actually, it's not just cults, it's corporations, it's any large group or small group of people. And it's again something to be very mindful about because you have to ask yourself when you start to hear these generalized comments about people in the group, do I really want to buy into this? Do I really agree?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really, really important and such to be mindful of that. So yeah,
Mhm.
divergent thinking is very important in today's society, and I would argue also within families, right? It's okay to have different ways of thinking, and if anything, it could add a refreshing view onto certain subject matters and topics that can, of course, be important for families and such.
We want to celebrate the differences rather than shut them down.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Celebrate the differences. Very, very important and such. So the last one that we have on our list here of biases for today is the status quo bias. Now, the status quo bias has to do with the preference to keep things the same rather than change them, right?
And this can have a really dangerous effect when there's a cutoff in the family because one family member may resist reaching out to an estranged sibling because it's going to disrupt the current dynamic. And I'm also reminded when I had a terrible split in my own family, and I finally had an opportunity to reconcile with my brother at the time. At that time, one of the relatives in the family said, "Well, what does that mean for me?"
Yeah.
In other words, wait a minute, you're not going to be on my team anymore.
Wow. So you can see this, right? You can see how this type of attitude can perpetuate estrangement even if reconciliation is possible. And I think that that's the thing that's really, really important with this type of bias, especially, is in recognizing that some people feel comfortable keeping things just the way they are, right? They become familiar with it. They know what to expect. They stay with it because they have that sense of familiarity, even though it might be wrong. It might not necessarily be healthy and such, but yet they'll stay with that because it's what they know.
What they know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very stultifying.
Yeah,
You don't
exactly.
grow. You don't grow. You don't change. You don't get unstuck.
Exactly. And that's what makes it hard for some people. But yet at the same time, some people seek comfort in stability. And unfortunately, stability doesn't always necessarily mean healthy. Doing the same thing over and over again can sometimes have a compounding effect sometimes on certain family members if we're not careful and such. So
Or, or it could mean avoidance.
yes, yes, exactly. And that's an interesting topic as well. The whole concept of avoidance as being something that prevents one from going into conflict management or emotional regulation and such. So these are really, really important themes that especially can come up, I think, within the sphere of sibling estrangement. So Fern, this is a great conversation. I always enjoy talking about this and such, and I'm really glad we had a chance to go through this list now of the second part now on bias and sibling estrangement. So, Fern, let's talk about resources now. What would be your number one resource for our viewers at this time?
Well, you can examine some of your biases in the Sibling Estrangement Journal, where you can write through some of your grief about a cutoff or estrangement and some of your assumptions about your estranged sibling.
Very, very important right there. I think that's key, especially. So, for me, my number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. This is something that I offer every couple of weeks. This is the only group, as far as I know, that is there for sibling estrangement and to be able to empower people so that they can, of course, strengthen themselves within their dynamics and find themselves and reclaim themselves ultimately to become better and healthier versions of who they are. So that is one resource I offer. I do offer, of course, some counseling towards people that are experiencing sibling estrangement issues or any types of mental health issues, of course, that may be affecting them associated to this and other topics and such. So I do, of course, encourage people to reach out to me if this is something that speaks to you. And yeah, so that is something that I am readily and happy to offer as well. So, Fern, thank you so much for doing this again. We're out of time right now. We'll have to, of course, leave our subject matter of interest for another day and time. So I'm very happy that we get to discuss sibling estrangement issues again together. And I very much look forward to our next time where we dive deeper still into these subject matters.
Well, I'm always struck by there's fact that there's no shortage of topics in estrangement.
It's quite profound. Absolutely. So thank you again for
Great to
doing
be
this.
with you. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.